I had always thought my family was a team, a unit built on shared sacrifices, love, and respect. From the time I could remember, I had done my part, working late shifts in high school to help with bills, saving my own money to contribute to family vacations, and always putting my father's expectations above my own desires. My sister, on the other hand, had been different, spoiled, entitled, and coddled by a father who seemed to worship her every whim. I had tolerated it, buried my resentment, and convinced myself it didn't matter, until the day I found out about the trust fund. It was subtle at first. A quiet comment from a family attorney during a casual lunch. Your father wanted to make sure your sister's future was secure. The trust fund is fully funded, and everything is in her name. My fork clattered onto my plate. I stared at the attorney as if he had grown a second head. What about me? I asked, voice tight with disbelief. Oh, well, he didn't mention setting up anything for you, the attorney said, almost apologetically, as though it were a trivial oversight. The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. My hands shook, and my chest felt heavy with a weight I couldn't name. I had been pouring my life, my energy, my money, into a family that clearly valued one child over the other. One child who had done far less and received far more. Later that evening, I confronted my father. The living room felt colder than usual, the fireplace crackling silently as if even the flames sensed the tension. Dad, why? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Why set up a trust fund only for her, after everything I've done for this family? He looked at me, his face a mixture of guilt and defensiveness. She needs it. She's special. You understand that, don't you? No, I don't. I shouted, the anger I had buried for years, erupting like a dam breaking. I've worked my entire life for this family. I've sacrificed for vacations, for bills for you, and yet I get nothing, nothing for my future. He shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my eyes. You'll be fine. You're smart, resourceful, you'll figure it out. The casual dismissal felt like a knife twisting in my gut. That night, I went to my room and stared at the ceiling, tears blurring my vision. I thought about all the times I had picked up the tab for my sister's whims, about the late nights working 2 jobs while she lounged by the pool or spent the trust fund that didn't even exist yet. I thought about fairness, about love, and about the way my father had quietly, and perhaps unknowingly taught me that I was less than her. And yet, beneath the hurt, beneath the betrayal, a tiny spark flickered. A thought that maybe, just maybe, I didn't have to accept this. Maybe I didn't have to keep funding the life of someone who had been given everything without effort. Maybe it was time to stop sacrificing. I clenched my fists and made a silent promise. I would no longer let their entitlement go unchecked. I would find a way to make them see, to make them understand without lowering myself to bitterness, without stooping to cruelty. I would let justice, subtle, sweet, and deliberate, unfold. For the first time, I felt a strange mix of anger and excitement. The scales had been tipped, and I was done standing in the shadows. After that night, everything shifted, though nothing appeared different on the surface. I stayed, smiling politely at my sister as she gushed about her upcoming vacation plans, all paid for with money I had helped manage, all under the illusion that our family was happy. I watched her chatter endlessly about exotic destinations, private villas, and extravagant dinners, and each word felt like a sting. Every detail of her carefree life reminded me that the world had already handed her what I had fought to earn. I found myself doing the calculations constantly in my head. The thousands of dollars I had contributed to their trips, the hours spent working overtime so that she could have spa weekends while I counted pennies, the sacrifices I had made so she could have everything handed to her, and all of it had gone unacknowledged. My father had smiled, my sister had laughed, and I had stayed silent, biting back the bitterness. But inside, resentment festered like a wound that wouldn't heal. It wasn't just the money, it was the principle, The way my father's eyes would soften when she succeeded at nothing, how he praised her for efforts I had poured my soul into. I felt invisible, like a ghost wandering through my own home, and the more I watched, the more I realized how fragile their bubble of privilege truly was. I began to notice cracks in her confidence, though she would never admit them. A missed booking, a delayed flight, a small expense she hadn't planned for. She would panic just slightly, a flicker of fear that I had rarely seen. My heart twisted at first, but then a different feeling took root: curiosity. If I stopped being the safety net, what would happen? If I let the consequences ripple naturally, would she finally see what it meant to live without everything handed to her? I started paying closer attention to the vacation home finances. Every bill, every tax, every maintenance cost was meticulously documented in the accounts I managed. For years, I had quietly absorbed these costs, telling myself it was family duty, nothing more. But now, the ledger became my weapon. Each number was a small measure of power I had been ignoring. At the same time, I grappled with guilt. Could I really just stop? Was it cruel to let her face reality, knowing she had never been prepared for it? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized the truth. She had been living in a gilded cage of entitlement, protected by my sacrifices. It was time for her to learn the hard lessons life had refused to teach her. My father remained oblivious. He still fawned over her successes, still smiled at her whims, still assumed I would quietly shoulder the burdens. But I had changed. I no longer wanted approval. I wanted fairness, and if that meant discomfort for her, then perhaps it was the most honest form of love I could give. And so I began to step back. Small things at first, delayed payments, subtle hints that bills were my responsibility no longer. The tension was almost imperceptible at first, but I could see her unease growing. I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sorrow. As if I were rewriting the rules of a game she thought she had already won. Watching them from the sidelines, I realized that power wasn't about money alone. It was about control, about awareness, about timing. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I had the upper hand. I didn't yet know how far I would go or what the cost would be. But I knew one thing with perfect clarity: I was no longer invisible. The first time I deliberately refused to cover the vacation home bill, the air between us shifted instantly. My sister's eyes widened in disbelief, her perfectly manicured fingers trembling as she read the invoice I had left on the kitchen counter. "Wait, you're not paying this?" she asked, voice sharp but incredulous, as though the very idea was absurd. I met her gaze evenly, letting a calmness she had never seen in me do the work for me. "No," I said simply. "It's not my responsibility anymore." For a moment, she looked as if I had broken some sacred law. The entitlement that had shielded her for so long faltered. Panic flickered across her face, and the first tremors of helplessness appeared. I tried not to smile too widely. This was about justice, not cruelty. But inside, a quiet satisfaction blossomed. Years of sacrifices, of invisibility, were finally asserting themselves in subtle, undeniable ways. The tension that followed was exquisite. My sister, who had always been so confident, so assured, now stumbled through conversations about payments, maintenance, and scheduling, realizing that life didn't bend simply to her whims. She called my father, expecting him to intervene, to wave a magic wand, to restore the flow of resources she believed was her birthright. But my father, though irritated, had finally begun to notice that I was no longer the silent enabler. I refused to answer his probing questions, my silence sharper than any argument I could have made. It wasn't easy. I felt a tug of guilt almost every day. I had loved my sister once, had cared for her well-being, but love wasn't blind, and fairness mattered more now than sentimentality. I began to watch her in a new light, noting the subtle cracks in her poise, the frustration she tried to hide beneath forced smiles, the way she hesitated when she realized her lifestyle wasn't guaranteed. With each delayed payment, each reminder that she was now responsible, I felt the scales tipping. And yet I didn't revel in humiliation. Instead, I allowed her to learn lessons I had wished someone had taught her years ago. The sharp sting of consequences was far more effective than any lecture I could have delivered. I became a quiet observer, a patient strategist, letting her unravel just enough to understand her privilege without completely breaking her. At the same time, I began to feel a strange surge of empowerment. I could see the balance of power shifting, the dynamic that had long placed me at the mercy of others, finally tilting in my favor. I realized that revenge didn't need to be loud or dramatic. It could be subtle, calculated, wrapped in civility while reshaping the world around me. I also noticed my father's discomfort. He fumed quietly, asking why I had changed, what had happened to the dutiful child he had raised. I offered no answers, just a calm, unwavering presence that silently communicated my refusal to be overlooked any longer. He couldn't scold me, couldn't guilt me, because for the first time I had taken the reins. The house, once a stage for my sister's extravagance, now hummed with tension. She walked on eggshells, unsure when the next bill would go unpaid, uncertain of the boundaries she had always assumed didn't exist. And I watched, both heart aching and chest swelling, as the lessons I had longed to impart unfolded in their own way. I knew this was only the beginning. The path ahead would be complex, filled with moral dilemmas and emotional strain. But I also knew that I would no longer be invisible, no longer the silent shadow in the background. I had found my voice, my power, and the quiet, sweet satisfaction of finally leveling the playing field. And for the first time in my life, I felt fully alive. The first winter after I stopped funding the vacation home was the coldest in memory, not because of the weather, but because of the tension it brought into the house. My sister had begun to unravel in ways that were at once frustrating and satisfying. No longer could she assume that everything would be taken care of. The bills she once brushed off now demanded attention. The small inconveniences, the scheduling conflicts, the rising maintenance costs, all of them chipped away at the bubble of entitlement she had long lived inside. I watched quietly as she struggled to adapt. Her usual arrogance was tempered by anxiety. Her confident laughter was replaced with hesitations. At first, it was difficult not to intervene, not to offer a lifeline as I always had. But I reminded myself that this was not cruelty, it was a lesson. Life had given her everything, and now she had to navigate without the safety net she had always assumed was there. My father noticed the shift too. He came to me one evening, the lines on his face deeper than they had ever been. "I didn't expect you to take such a hard stance," he admitted, voice tinged with worry and something else, perhaps pride, perhaps fear. I met his gaze steadily, feeling a strength that I had never known before. "I didn't take a stance," I said softly. "I simply stopped being the enabler. She needed to see reality, and I need to live my own life without carrying hers." There was a long silence, the kind that fills a room with more meaning than any words could convey. My father's eyes flickered with understanding, and for the first time, I saw a hint of regret in him. Maybe he realized that his favoritism had hurt both of us in ways he could not repair. But there was nothing left to repair, not entirely. What had been broken could only be acknowledged, not erased. And then there was my sister. She began to falter, small things at first. Missed bookings, delayed payments, phone calls to contractors she couldn't manage alone. She looked to me for guidance, for reassurance, and I held my ground. I offered no handouts, only quiet presence. Slowly, subtly, she began to understand what life without entitlement felt like. The realization was bitter, humbling, and painfully slow, but it was hers to internalize. Yet amidst the tension, something unexpected happened. She changed in ways neither of us could have predicted. The arrogance softened, replaced by an awkward humility. The entitlement melted, leaving behind glimpses of gratitude, not just toward me, but toward the world she had taken for granted. And though I did not forgive easily, I felt a strange warmth in witnessing her growth, a satisfaction deeper than any victory could provide. By the time spring arrived, the household had shifted irrevocably. I had learned the power of boundaries, of self-respect, of carefully measured consequences. My sister had learned that life demanded accountability, that privilege could be fragile, and that the world would not always hand her what she wanted. My father, too, had learned something important, that love without fairness breeds resentment, and that a family's strength is measured by equity, not favoritism. I stood on the balcony one evening, watching the sunlight glint off the snow melting from the roof. The house was quieter now, the tension still present but tempered by understanding. I had achieved my subtle revenge not by cruelty, but by allowing life itself to teach the lessons my father had failed to. And as the wind touched my face, I felt something I had not felt in years: peace. The scales were finally balanced, and though the scars remained, I had reclaimed my place not as a shadow, not as a caretaker of someone else's life, but as a person fully seen, fully empowered, and finally free.